Forט Kapa, a small town in Canada where tradition and family values are important to everyone.
Fort Kapa is a typical prairie town, very quiet. It's in the Capel Valley, about an hour east of Regina, and it has a significant native population because there are a number of reserves around the town site.
It's a great place to raise children. Forт Kapa is a very nice, small-knit community.
But the idyllic town would be shaken to the core by a hideous act of violence. On a quiet Thursday evening, a frantic woman phoned 911, and the police were dispatched to the home of Kριστίνας Κουκ Sr.
It was a shots fired call. That's a call that we don't receive very often. When we were outside the house, there wasn't a sound to be heard. You could hear a pin drop.
The police approached the house with extreme caution.
When I first got to the house, I noticed shell casings on the deck itself, and I was careful not to disturb them.
The bullet casings hinted at the horror that awaited them inside. And when a woman opened the door and ran past them, they braced themselves for the worst.
She had a look of fear, sadness, and hysteria on her face.
In the living room, they observed a gruesome scene.
There was people everywhere. I immediately noticed a lot of blood on the floor and on the walls of the house. Lying on the floor was a young man. I noticed that he had been shot in the face and the cheek, and he was bleeding quite a bit, but his eyes were open, he was conscious, and he was looking at me.
The policeman called for backup and started to search the house, where they found more victims.
As I continued through the house, I saw two men slumped over with their backs toward me. It was quite clear that they were both deceased.
Stunned silence turned to grief and chaos as several survivors emerged from hiding. News of the shooting spread quickly through the small town. Anxious family members gathered at the scene.
When I arrived at the house, there was police there, there were people crying, there were people all over the place, people being loaded up into ambulances. I wasn't sure where my son was. The police were telling me to step back.
She was panicked, I was panicked. Something had happened to Mikey, and we couldn't find out what happened to my brother.
Talking to the survivors, police began to get a glimpse of the evening's events in what was one of the bloodiest mass shootings in Saskatchewan history. Earlier that night, a party was in full swing.
302 Pasco Avenue was a very welcoming place. It was a house where kids were welcome to go at all times, and they could hang out and party, and it was considered a safe place.
According to her granddaughter, it was just a typical night at Kριστínας Κουκ Sr.'s house.
There's about 13 of us, just chilling out, having some beers, some laughs, having a good time.
At one point, Kристίνα moved to the bedroom to socialize as the party continued in the living room.
We were laughing around about something anyways. Somebody was singing or something, actually, and we were laughing at them. And then somebody walked in through the door.
At about 10 p.m., the front door was kicked open. Witnesses briefly saw two masked men. The party descended into chaos.
And as soon as I seen that gun, and I went and stashed behind the door.
And not a minute too soon, as the gunman entered the bedroom.
Never heard real gunshots before. I was scared.
In the aftermath of the shooting, many people were seriously injured, but two men were pronounced dead at the scene. Among the dead was Marvin, the 51-year-old husband of Kριστínας Κουκ. The other victim was 24-year-old Michael Ititakus. Michael's family anxiously waited for news, unaware of his fate.
All I remember is wanting to know is, where is my brother? What is going on?
In the early hours of the morning, the police went to Michael's mother's home with terrible news.
And it was then when Tim Sports informed me that there was a shooting at the house, which I knew because of the phone call, and I went there and visually seen all the panic. But he informed me that there was people shot, and unfortunately, he said one of the people that have passed away was my son.
All I remember seeing everybody, my family, the cops that were there. I went to my mom's bathroom and I just remember crying and crying and crying.
Her little brother Michael Ititakus had been shot 6 times in the back. He was just 24 years old and left behind a young 3-year-old son of his own. Investigators were determined to find out how such a violent murder could happen in their sleepy town. But as the police spoke with survivors in the bloody aftermath of the shooting, they realized that the eyewitness accounts were not matching up.
Some people thought they heard different types of weapons. Some thought maybe there was shotgun involved, or a rifle, or handgun. Well, there's so much panic and pandemonium going on in the residence. Everybody's got different perspectives. They hear different things. They see different things depending on where they're positioned.
Well, in the chaos, what they remembered most clearly was that the assailants were wearing bandanas across their faces. And they have no idea who the shooters are. So they couldn't conceive of who might want to do something like this. It was totally out of the ordinary.
Investigators arrived at the scene hoping that physical evidence would explain what the survivors couldn't seem to.
We got to the house about 2 in the morning. I took some photographs of the area as we found it, marked some obvious evidence, shell cases, blood stains on the floor, and then photographed where the deceased were laying in the bedroom.
Forensic expert John Marshall was called in to gather evidence related to the guns used in the shootings.
One of my first jobs when I go to a crime scene is to identify and locate the number of expended cartridge cases. This will typically indicate the minimum number of shots fired. We had located 23 expended cartridge cases, and this indicated to me that there was going to be a lot of work to be done at the scene.
The forensics team were able to use the distribution of cartridge casings across the crime scene to track the shooter's movements throughout the assault. They mapped out the rough path of each shot and recreated the scene.
Well, we found 3 expended cartridge cases located by the front steps. This would seem to indicate that the shooter was positioned outside the residence with the door open, shooting inside.
The gunmen then worked their way inside the house, firing 9 shots and striking 3 people in the living room. The gunman's path of destruction ended in the bedroom, where a brutal 11 more shots were discharged.
A visual inspection of the expended cartridge cases at the scene showed that they all had the same firing pin impression shape. This would indicate that one firearm was probably used in the shooting and probably one shooter. The large number of shots fired would seem to indicate a semi-automatic type firearm.
Of the 23 shots fired, only 4 impact points were discovered in the walls of the home.
This indicated that 19 of the 23 shots actually hit individuals. The fact that 5 individuals were hit with multiple projectiles as the shooter was moving through the house would seem to indicate that he was very calm and competent with his shooting.
The image of a skilled and deadly marksman began to take shape. A final fact from the crime scene ruled out burglary.
When we examined the scene, it didn't appear consistent to be motivated with theft. The TV was still in place. Nothing appeared to be stolen from the area.
Whoever the gunman was, he was out for blood. But what could have motivated such a cold and deadly rampage?
Our reaction is adrenaline fueled. We knew we had a big job ahead of us. We weren't going to stop until we did find out who did this.
But would they find the ruthless killer before he struck again? 2 people were dead and 3 in a critical condition following a shooting at a house party. Police had no suspects, and a small community was overwhelmed by shock and grief. The victims were 51-year-old grandfather Marvin Arno and 24-year-old father Michael Ititakus.
I had no idea who would have shot my son because he was very well liked. Michael was very well liked. He made many friends of all different ages.
Michael's young son would grow up without a father.
My brother was very protective as a parent. He ensured that Isaiah was always cared for, him and my sister-in-law, Jen. They would do everything for Isaiah. They always used to help me out because they always kept my son and my daughter all the time.
Those caring family men were gone, executed by an unknown assassin. To catch their killer, investigators had to get a clear picture of the evening's events. As their interviews with survivors progressed, the picture of what happened that night got more and more confusing.
In terms of providing us with an accurate reflection as to who did what and where they were, very, very difficult. Certainly we could get one person's story, but somebody else just being in another room in the house, it could be totally different.
It was a crazy scene. Someone walked into their house and started shooting, and people were diving for cover, hiding in the closet, running downstairs, and many of them were getting shot. So it was too chaotic to remember anything.
By cross-referencing statements, investigators were able to learn how victims Michael Ititakus and 51-year-old Marvin Arno had spent the final moments of their lives.
I remember sitting on my grandfather's bed, and right when you walk in, that's the first thing, like, that's straight across is my grandma's room, and there's the bed, like, right in front of the door.
As soon as the shooting began, Christina had hidden in the wardrobe, unseen by the gunman when they entered the room.
The next thing that happened was that the grandmother went for the phone to try to call the police. And the shooters noticed this, and they turned towards her. But at the same moment that he opens fire, Marvin Arno dives on top of the grandmother and takes the bullet that was intended for her. He said to her, look after the kids. She was sort of surprised that he would be saying that at a time when someone was shooting the house. She said, are you hurt? And he said, yeah, I think so. And that was the last thing he ever said to her. He died.
When I came out, my grandmother and my grandfather were on one side. Mike was on the other side of the other bed. I remember it was just dead silence. There was nothing, no sound in that house at all.
Those two deaths were a tragedy for their loved ones, but the death toll could have been much higher.
For the amount of people that were shot in the violence that was used, it's pretty unbelievable that more people didn't die that day.
Three of them were pretty seriously injured. One was shot in the face, another, I think, in the arm, and the third was shot 9 times, which is pretty incredible. They eventually made full recoveries, but they were very lucky to be alive.
The community struggled to find a motive.
Families and the survivors wonder why it happened, and they start going through their mind who did it. And in this case, a shooter came in and a shooter left. So they're wondering, where is this shooter? Is this shooter going to come back and target them? Are they going to do something further?
Frustrated by the slow trickle of information, investigators kept working with the witnesses, hoping that more information would come to light as the immediate trauma passed.
Our investigation, it's normal for us to try to determine what took place before the incident happened, retrace people's steps.
The police investigation revealed that on the evening of the shooting, Michael Ititakus and 3 other people from the party had been at a local bar.
There aren't a lot of places to go in Fortt Kapel for a night out, so Thursday, Friday, I think a lot of people would go to Trapper's Bar if they wanted to have a drink.
Investigators headed to the popular night spot and questioned the employees. They confirmed that several of the victims, including Michael Ititakus and another victim, Percy Pascal, who was in a critical condition after being shot, had been there on the night of the shooting. And that wasn't all they discovered.
We learned that there had been an altercation at the bar. It didn't sound like there was anything physical that went on, but it involved a group of people who were at the house as well as a stranger, and it was important for us to figure out who that stranger was.
But past tensions reared their head, and once again, details were hard to come by.
The relationship between law enforcement and the Native community has not always been an easy one in Saskatchewan. There's a lot of history there, and sometimes that can cause a little friction.
When you're in a small community, a lot of times the people you are speaking to are related to either the suspects, the victims. So the community likes to stay tight-knit, and when you start dealing with people, they don't want to speak badly about others, or they don't want to get involved.
It was a very difficult investigation. The circumstances behind it, it causes obviously great concern. Some investigations are really easy, straightforward. Others you have to work a lot harder on. This is certainly one of those.
Tip-off phone lines were set up at the police station, and a province-wide appeal for help went out to the public. After several days, a number of suspects had come to light.
Any names or possible hints of suspects, obviously we investigate them to the fullest to either rule them in or rule them out.
The police were able to quickly clear and find alibis for all of these suspects, except one.
We received a tip that a male who was known to police was seen in Fortt Kαπel on Thursday night, the night of the shooting.
The man had been arrested several times when he lived in Fortk Kапel and looked to be building his criminal career further as a resident of Saskatoon. Given the severity of the crime and the man's known history of violence, police needed to talk with him fast to find out what he'd been doing in town on the night of the shootings, and if needs be, get him off the streets. Pursuing what could be the case's first legitimate lead, Sergeant Brent Ross and his partner drove 4 hours north to Saskatoon. The officers prepared themselves to come face to face with the man who could be the cold-hearted killer. In the wake of a mass shooting, 2 family men were dead, several more were critically injured, and a grieving community demanded justice. The police were looking for a criminal who they believed to be an expert gunman. In connection with an anonymous tip-off, they sent out 2 investigators north to the city of Saskatoon. Sergeant Brent Ross and his partner confronted the suspect at his workplace.
He was a larger gentleman, 6 feet, 240, worked in a construction job in Saskatoon. We were quite upfront with him. We told him that we were there investigating the double murder in Fortt Kapel. And he was aware of it, and he told us that he was not in Fortt Kapel at the time of the murders.
The man claimed he worked Thursdays and was in the shop until at least 8 p.m. on the night of the shooting.
We were able to speak to a supervisor. He confirmed that he was working the Thursday and Thursday evening. Therefore, he couldn't have been in Fortt Kapel, and it proved that the tip was not valid.
It was another blow to an investigation that had no decent leads, leaving 2 shattered families to bury their dead with no answers to their questions.
My grandmother took it really hard. My grandmother was very, ill, cancer. She had a lot of things wrong with her. And Mike took really good care of her.
As a mother, to lose my son, it was one of the hardest things I've ever had to deal with in my life. Because as a parent, you bring your children into this world, and you hold them when they're small, and you look after their every need, and they're supposed to outlive you. But when you outlive your children, it's a hard thing for a parent to have to deal with.
For now, the person responsible for their grief remained a mystery. The police suspected the shooting may have stemmed from an altercation at a local bar earlier in the evening. But no witnesses seemed willing to discuss the fight with them. Police would need to find their answers elsewhere.
Surveillance video. We were fortunate to have surveillance video at the bar, which gave us a picture as to which people were there and potentially what else might have happened.
Police seized the CCTV footage from the bar. But getting an accurate look at the sequence of events from that night was easier said than done.
Well, you're dealing with technology, first of all, so where are those cameras? Finding out the locations. Do they shoot the entire bar, or there's certain areas? You have to track one person from one camera to the next camera to the next camera. And for all the people in the bar, you try to do the same. So you can put everybody together at, say, 7:15. Where is everybody? What are they doing?
Multiple investigators viewed the footage. They used eyewitness accounts to try and get a better picture of the evening's events.
And at that time, we were able to identify a majority of the people at the bar that night, but there's still a handful of people we had no clue who they were.
Deceased Michael Atitikus, as well as critically injured Percy Pascal and a few others, were spotted on the car park CCTV pulling up in a blue truck.
After arriving, they went straight to the bar and started ordering drinks.
Almost immediately, the group of friends noticed a stranger playing pool.
There was one person that nobody seemed to know. None of the witnesses were able to identify him. It was a young native man who had a long ponytail. He had a white tank top on and had a lot of tattoos.
Investigators first spotted the stranger on the CCTV footage when he entered the bar alone 15 minutes before Michael and his friends.
So the guy with the ponytail continued to socialize, bought a few more drinks. He chatted with a waitress and started walking around the bar. He made his way over to where the soon-to-be victim Percy Pascal was with his friends. Based on all the information that we had, Percy and this guy with the ponytail exchanged some words. There's a little posturing going on.
Percy's friends got involved as the conflict seemed to heat up. The stranger seemed more than capable of holding his own.
It escalated quickly. There was a lot of tension in the air. Nobody was throwing any fists at this point, but nobody was going to back down either.
Unfortunately, the video surveillance didn't have any audio, so we don't know what was exchanged between the man with the ponytail and Percy, because something, right at that time and moment, started a conflict between the two of them.
At 7:41 p.m., Michael and his friends walked away from the confrontation. They were seen purchasing alcohol at the bar to take away with them, and then heading to the car park.
After Percy and his friends leave the bar, the guy with the ponytail grabs a pool ball and he turns away from the camera. And what we believe he was doing is he takes a pool ball and puts it into a sock.
Though badly outnumbered, the stranger followed the group outside, improvised weapon in hand, ready to fight.
He runs out the door and he sees the truck with Percy Pascal and his friends driving off quickly. The guy with the ponytail then comes back in. He's using his cell phone, where he then purchases some alcohol and leaves the bar.
But with witnesses still unwilling or unable to fill in the gaps, investigators had to work with what they had.
We took the bar surveillance video and we got it enhanced. And from that, we were able to identify that there were some specific things about our mystery man. Our male had a number of identifiable tattoos, and one of the specific tattoos he had was "Red Till Dead," which was located on his neck. The "Red Till Dead" tattoo is actually quite synonymous with the native gang, the Indian Posse.
But Fort's Copel and the surrounding areas were not known to be Indian Posse territory. Investigators needed to find out who the stranger was and what he was doing in town.
From that photograph, we were able to identify the tattoos, and based on their location, sometimes the color, we were able to put them into a certain database that the police retains and do a search to find out if there's anybody with those similar tattoos, and that way it can help us identify potential suspects.
Investigators soon attached a name to the face of their suspect.
We were able to identify the male with the ponytail as being Daniel Wolf.
They learned that they're dealing with not just any criminal, but a guy who has a reputation as one of the most notorious criminals in all of Canada.
Daniel Wolf had a long criminal background. Arrested 20 times before he was even 12, he'd been helping his brother form what would eventually become one of the deadliest gangs in Canada.
Further investigation found that Danny was actually a ranking member of the Indian posse, and actually he was in charge of the Indian posse in Manitoba at the time of the shooting.
At the age of 31, Daniel Wolfe was one of the heads of a criminal organization whose territory stretched from coast to coast.
The Indian posse were known for being willing to do things that other gangs weren't. They were extremely violent, not just violent, but willing to resort to violence very quickly, very early on.
Among those violent gangsters, Wolfe was known for being especially ruthless.
He had an issue with his temper. He would go from 0 to 100 very quickly. He would be very aggressive, get very violent.
Investigators were stunned to discover this dangerous man had been in their small town. What could have brought him here? With such a ruthless killer on the loose, it was only a matter of time before more lives were lost. Investigators took a more urgent and aggressive approach with the community, especially with the survivors of the shooting. They needed someone to start talking, and fast.
Once we knew who Danny was, it allowed us investigatively to do more with the file. We were able to do background checks, find out why he was in the area, what was going on, talk to family members, and that can sometimes be a pivotal point in an investigation.
Investigators dug deeper into the suspect's background, hoping for some clues about what he'd been doing at Forт Kапel and his possible connection to the victims.
Danny was born in 1976 in Regina, Saskatchewan, and when he was about 3 years old, his mother and father moved to Winnipeg. After some time, Danny's mother returned to the Regina area, just east of Forт Kapel, where she lived at the time of the shooting.
In the spring of 2007, Wolfe finished his latest jail sentence, but instead of heading home to Winnipeg, he'd visited his family just outside Forт Kapel.
The RCMP learned that Wolfe had been in the area for a few months and that he had been laying low, I think trying to gather himself after spending a long time in the penitentiary and just starting to establish some Indian posse operations in the area.
Daniel Wolfe's time in Forт Kapel was relatively quiet until a chance encounter on the 20th of September in Trapper's Bar.
When we interviewed the witnesses at the bar, we learned about what the altercation and argument was about and gave us kind of more information as towards motive for the shooting that took place later that evening.
Learning content of the argument, investigators were able to unearth a secret truth, not about Wolfe, but about the victims. Like Daniel Wolfe, they'd had gang affiliations as well, but not in the Indian posse.
Percy might have said something along the lines of, what are you doing around these parts? Because Forт Kapel was not known as an Indian posse town. It was more commonly associated with the Native Syndicate gang. But Wolfe wasn't about to back down from anybody. And so his response was, you don't know who you're messing with.
Even as the circumstantial evidence piled up, survivors were still unable to identify Wolfe as their attacker. They had to find a way to connect him to the crime scene before he slipped out of their grasp. Luckily, the right tip fell into their hands.
We had learned that 5 days before the murders took place in Forт Kapel, the complaint was made that a person matching Daniel Wolfe's description was firing off the back deck of the residence.
By the time the police had responded to the noise complaint, the home was quiet and dark. The incident was filed away without further investigation.
So we sent out investigators to follow up on the complaint. The investigators spoke to the neighbor, who then was able to identify Daniel Wolfe as being the person who was shooting from that residence.
So we were able to get a search warrant ultimately as a result of that information.
Investigators came up empty-handed inside the home, but outside, their search proved far more rewarding.
We discovered several .22 caliber long rifle rimfire cartridge cases that had been fired. These were consistent with the ammunition and the shell cases located in the home at Forт Kapel.
Investigators rushed the evidence to their forensics lab.
I compared the expended cartridge cases from the crime scene to the expended cases seized from the house. And that conclusion was that they were both fired in the same firearm.
This put the murder weapon in Daniel Wolf's hands 5 days before the shooting. But this was not enough evidence to press charges. But operating a firearm was a breach of Wolf's parole.
Daniel Wolf was on his way into Regina, where upon entering the city, the Regina Police Service pulled him over and found out that he had a warrant on their system for a parole violation. Daniel was arrested for that and he was taken into custody without any incident.
But Wolf's arrest only put more pressure on the investigators. On a simple parole violation, they wouldn't be able to keep him locked up for long. Unless they could build their murder case in time, Wolf could walk away.
I think it was important to take Wolf into custody when we did. It allowed us as investigators a little bit more freedom to speak with people and allow them to be more comfortable in talking to us.
With Wolf behind bars, fears of retribution were eased as investigators searched the area once again. This time they found someone who finally admitted to seeing Wolf on the night of the murder. In fact, he admitted to being with him.
Gerard Grambois lived at the same house with Danny because he was actually dating Daniel's cousin. While he was living there, he got to know Danny and he was intimidated by him.
Pressured by the police, Grambois confessed to being the getaway driver after the shooting that night. He said that Daniel and another accomplice were the ones who'd entered the house. And since they had only one gun between them, Daniel had been the one who had shot everyone.
Gerard was a key witness in this investigation. He was able to fill in a lot of the gaps in the investigation that we didn't know.
Gerard, everything you told me, I want you to tell the camera.
With Grambois' help, investigators easily discovered the identity of Wolf's other accomplice. He was a young offender, originally from Manitoba, and a loyal member of the Indian posse, known only as Sonny. With Wolf in jail and Grambois already talking, his best option was to follow suit and confess. But a statement from Wolf's accomplices may not have been enough to secure a conviction. So investigators got ambitious. They decided to get the whole story from Daniel Wolf himself. To get their main man, the investigators came up with a big plan. But if Daniel Wolf managed to get off the hook, there was no telling when or where he would turn up next. Losing him now was not an option. The police had one of Canada's most dangerous criminals in custody. If they could prove his involvement in a vicious mass shooting, they would be able to lock him up for life.
Our plan in interrogating Wolf was fairly simple. It was to use what we knew about him and about the circumstances of the incident against him.
The RCMP knew that Danny Wolf was an experienced criminal. He'd been in the justice system since he was 12 years old. They tried to implicate him in a number of serious cases in the past, unsuccessfully. So he was going to take care to cover his tracks.
Daniel Wolf was one of those individuals who thought that he could get away with anything, either by being smarter than the police or just by straight intimidation.
The clock was ticking as investigators would have to release Daniel Wolf in 2 days, and they still didn't have the confession they needed to convict him. So they arranged a secret operation to stage an elaborate ruse to get it. It began when 2 officers entered Wolf's prison cell and informed him that he was being charged with the murders of 24-year-old Michael Ititikus and 51-year-old Marvin Arnault. He was then handcuffed and informed that he was being transferred to another prison.
So Danny Wolf was put in a cruiser. He's sitting out front of the RCMP station when a second cruiser pulls up. And in the back seat, they've got a pretty tough-looking character who's also a prisoner. RCMP officers get out and they start talking to their colleagues, and they're gesturing, kind of making a show of demonstrating what they've just seized off this guy.
The weapons made an impression on Daniel Wolf, as did the suspect in the other vehicle, just as the police had hoped.
When Daniel Wolf was brought back to the RCMP detachment, he was escorted immediately into the interview room, and that's where the interrogation took place.
This was not the gangster's first time being interrogated. For several hours, he remained calm and collected, even cooperative.
Members of the polygraph unit spent 8 hours alone in the room with Danny trying to get him to talk.
There was an evidence presentation that was done showing to him the evidence that we had supporting that he was responsible for the shootings in Fortk Capel. Daniel never confirmed nor denied his involvement.
Wolf continued to play dumb until the interrogator said it was time to take a break. He left the room with his laptop left open on the table.
Well, that was all part of the plan. They wanted Danny to look on that laptop. They wanted him to know what they had. And they wanted him to feel like, the room was closing in on him.
Wolf only needed to watch a few moments of Grambois' confession on video to realize he'd been betrayed. Shutting down the interrogation for the night, Wolf was led to his new prison cell, where he found a familiar face.
When Danny Wolf was placed in the cells, he knew who the guy was because he recognized him from having seen him outside in the back of the cop car where they pulled the weapons. So the guy explained to him, as they were sitting in the cells, that he was transporting some guns for a motorcycle gang.
As the evening wore on, the gun runner asked Wolf if the police had anything serious on him.
When Danny comes back into cells, he's just seen the video. He's angry, he's frustrated, he's despondent, and he's saying to the guy, I should have killed him when I had the chance because they'd given him up.
Daniel complained to his cellmate of how Grambois had told all. When the man asked what had happened, Wolf told him all about it.
After the incident at the bar, Danny hooks up with Gerard, and they go and they pick up a semi-automatic .22, and they head into Fortk Capel looking for these guys.
With an underage Indian posse recruit in tow, Wolf explained how the native syndicate boys had disrespected him at the bar. He said he couldn't let them get away with it. They prowled the streets for 40 minutes before Wolf finally spotted the truck he'd seen driving off from the bar's car park. The address was 302 Pascoe Avenue, and it seemed there was a party inside.
So they get out of the van, they walk straight to the house, up the stairs, they smash open the door and open fire.
But Wolf had no idea he had just given a detailed murder confession to an undercover police officer.
It was a really well-executed sting. They convinced Danny that their undercover operator was a bad dude like him, that he could open up to him, and he did.
I think Daniel's a very proud gang member. I think he took pride in his association, his affiliation with the gang, and I think he took pride in what happened in Fortk Capel, and I think ultimately he had to brag about it.
There were snipers on the rooftop of the courthouse as Daniel Wolf's high-profile murder trial began.
The gang was well known for its practice of intimidating witnesses. In fact, Danny had already been convicted of taking a shotgun to someone's house and saying, if you show up in court, you'll be dead.
But none of Wolf's Indian posse family showed up. And throughout the trial, it became increasingly clear how little the crime had to do with gang business.
The shooting was it was over something that was just a stupid incident that took place at the barn. It was overkill.
I think a lot of it had to do with his ego and his impulsivity. He took it personally and felt that he had to retaliate because the people didn't know who he was.
Daniel Wolf was found guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder and 3 counts of attempted murder. He was given 5 life sentences. But his conviction would not bring back Martin Arno to his beloved wife, or Michael Ititakus to his young son.
Michael's son Isaiah was 3 years old at the time his father passed away, and he's 9 now. He still remembers his dad. He was a good father.